episode of Surviving the Survivor, we bring you the best guests in all of true crime. Don't forget to subscribe and smash that like button. Here's your host, Emmy Award-winning broadcaster, Joel Waldman.
What's up, STS Nation, and welcome to another episode of Surviving the Survivor. It is the podcast that promises to bring you the very best guests in all of true crime. It is not a tagline. It is our reality here. And before we get going with anything at all, it is a historic day. Today is the COE's birthday, February 19th. I'll tell you what year she was born, but she's a lot younger than I am, which bothers me. But it's kind of a good thing. And so happy birthday to the COE, otherwise known as Bugs, otherwise known as Ileana, otherwise known as Mom. We were up bright and early and had the wonderful idea of playing Happy Birthday on YouTube. I realized that YouTube has absolutely everything in the world. I'm just figuring this out now in 2025, but I proceeded to play Happy Birthday in about 17 different languages as she was asleep and wanted to kill me. And the kids were all singing it along with me in different languages. We didn't even know what some of the languages were, but even in the Nepali language, I played Happy Birthday, and I don't know why, but I did. And like I said, she wanted to kill me. But happy birthday, and we are going to celebrate later today. But first, I got a podcast, then you got a girls' basketball game, my oldest daughter, and then we will do something fun. But today, we are here with best guest, Josh Ritter, former prosecutor of the year, current criminal defense attorney, but more importantly, host of Courtroom Confidential. You see it on there. One of the best new podcasts. Check it out. It's not even that new anymore, but it is a great podcast, so please check it out. And then we've got Tara Malik. That is not a green screen behind her. That is the beautiful state of Idaho, coming to us from, I believe, are you in Boise today?
I'm in Boise today.
She's in Boise, the home of the soon-to-be Bryan Kohberger trial. And I was talking to Josh Ritter. We're both thinking of heading out there and covering this trial once it starts. I think it's mid-August. August 11th, I believe, is the trial start day. Tara does defense work out of Boise, travels around the state, knows the case well. For those who do not know the case, it takes us back to November 13th, 2022, a day that will forever live in the minds of everyone at the University of Idaho and elsewhere. It was the night that Kaylee Gonzalez, Maddie Mogan, Ethan Chapin, and of course, Xana Kernodle, they were brutally stabbed to death in an off-campus house near the university. Authorities say that they believe it was Bryan Kohberger, who was a criminology PhD student at nearby Washington State University. They say that he entered the home between 4 and 4:25 in the morning and attacked the victims with a large knife. We're going to get into the importance of that knife today. But they essentially linked him through a knife sheath that was left behind. So there have been some developments. Before we get to those developments, Tara, to you, I mean, you're there in Boise, and I think I've asked you this before, but I mean, is there, I don't know, is this being discussed in the streets of Boise, or is this just sort of an other case? Because from afar, it's one of the biggest criminal cases that I can recall. And I'm just wondering if, within the Boise community, people discuss this, or it's kind of a little premature with the trial still a few months off.
I think it's being discussed certainly in the attorney world, attorney circles. Everything is, it's being written about in the Idaho Statesman pretty frequently with updates. And so I think as attorneys, we're always curious about the legal nuances of a case. So I think there's a group there. And then I do think that there's a group of people who have been following it from the get-go who are really curious about where this is heading and have been keeping up with the updates. But, by and large, is it out in the streets with random folks, or is everyone, talking about it or protesting, or no, that's not the case.
Yeah. Well, at least not yet. And hopefully, the people of Boise are civil, unlike where I'm from, New Jersey, New York. So hopefully it'll stay tame. But obviously, the big news, and I got to give a shout out to Kevin Fixler. He writes for the Idaho Statesman, which Tara just mentioned, and he's kind of been the lead print reporter on all of this. So the most recent story is obviously a very interesting one. And Josh, I know you covered some of this on Courtroom Confidential. There's now a word of unidentified male DNA at the crime scene. Defense attorneys revealing that this blood from two unidentified males was again found. One, I guess, specimen of this DNA is found on a handrail inside the off-campus home on a handrail. The other discovered on a glove located just outside the house. And it's interesting, Josh, because I remember early on, there was a glove that was found kind of after the fact on the front lawn. I don't know if you remember this, but there was a glove that investigators, and it's like several days later, like a few several days later, that was found. And I'm wondering if this is the same glove. But what do you make of the fact that suddenly you went from this touch DNA on the knife sheath to the defense saying, hold up, we've got two, again, samples of male DNA unidentified in two different areas of this house. There are people making a huge deal about it. Well, he's going to walk. This is enough reasonable doubt. How do you see it as a former prosecutor of the year, criminal defense attorney, and host of Courtroom Confidential?
Well, yeah, I think that they were aware that there was other blood located earlier on, but now the big revelation is that this is unidentified male DNA. And I know a lot of people on the defense side of this are kind of lighting their hair on fire, like pointing at that saying, look, this shows that there were other people there. This shows that there was, possibly another suspect. That means that there could be somebody who's responsible for this that's not Bryan Kohberger. But I think, as always with these things, it's important to take a deep breath and realize. And then the other thing that they point out, along with all that hysteria, is that it was never submitted to what is called CODIS, which is the kind of national criminal database for tracking these down DNA profiles. And it's usually the first place that investigators go is enter a profile into CODIS and see if they get any hits. Okay. So with all of that said, one thing important to know is that DNA present does not tell us when that DNA was put there, does not tell us if that DNA is at all connected to the crime that we're concerned with. That was a home that was, it was a college house where they had parties. People are in and out of that home. So the idea that they're finding other genetic material should not be all that shocking to anyone. The next question becomes, is it at all connected to the crime? And so far, police believe that it may not be. But the other part about this is, just because there was other genetic material found in that home, does that somehow mean that Bryan Kohberger, whose DNA was found on the knife sheath next to the victim or underneath one of the victims, is somehow doesn't connect him to that crime any longer? In other words, it's not mutually exclusive. Just because they found evidence that someone else may have been in the home does not mean that Bryan Kohberger is somehow not still implicated in this crime. So I think the biggest part about it for the defense is that they are pointing to the fact that it remains unidentified, and therefore there's this question of, could other people have been involved? Why didn't the police pursue this more? Why wasn't this ever submitted to CODIS? And there's reasons for that, but I think the defense is kind of enjoying the ambiguity of it.
Yeah, they're definitely riding on the ambiguity of it, no doubt. We'll get back to what Josh was saying about not having it, been tested. But Tara, you went, I think, to University of Idaho School of Law, right? You went there,
I
so you
did.
know the
Yep.
you know the university well. And this was an off-campus house. It wasn't a fraternity house, but it was definitely close. It was a party house. So, I mean, what do you think this does for the case and the uh, challenges? Does this help the defense, or in your opinion, is it kind of much ado about nothing? We are talking about unidentified male DNA in a capital case here, where Bryan Kohberger could face the death penalty. But again, in a house with that many people going in and out, wouldn't you expect there to be other male DNA? Keeping in mind that this is blood DNA, from what I understand, but nevertheless still DNA.
Yeah, I think there's two parts here. So where we are in the trial process right now, or the pretrial process right now, is at the suppression hearing stage, which is the defense has filed a bunch of different motions asking that the court suppress or exclude certain evidence from being introduced at trial. And then we've got the second part, which is trial and what this means for trial. And I think those are two different kind of analyses. At this stage, the defense is trying to do exactly what Josh was talking about, which is, hey, there's this other DNA out there. It hasn't been tested. I think that one of the arguments that had been made by the defense attorneys was, trying to make hay out of that, the fact that, hadn't even been presented to the magistrate judge when law enforcement was asking for search warrants. And I believe that Judge Hippler had responded and said, how does that change anything? Because you still have the knife sheath there, and that had DNA on it. Yeah. So does it do anything here at the suppression stage? I don't think so. I don't think it changes really anything. I think that the state has a really strong argument against suppression. But part two is, okay, so if we get through this suppression hearing and evidence or critical evidence isn't suppressed, we go to trial. What does that mean for trial? Because now you're trying this case and the facts of this case before a jury. So is a jury going to hear this information about this 2 or 3 other pieces of DNA that were never tested? How are they going to factor this into their determination of whether or not there is reasonable doubt that it really was Bryan Kohberger who committed these murders? And that is, I think, where this information might have the most power. And we'll see. We'll have to see what that looks like.
Yeah. By the way, Jack Russell here, no relation to the terrier, letting me know that the glove was found 3 weeks later by the dumpster. So it was a good amount of time. I'm assuming it is that glove that was found. Josh Ritter from Mary Kolovich, why has this taken so long to bring to trial, Josh? I mean, it is a capital case, but again, we talked about it. November 13th of 2022 is when this happened, and now we're in February of 20. I should know, it's my wife's birthday. February 19th of 2020. I was looking at the date. February 19th of 2025, and we still have a ways to go. Is this typical? I think it's fairly typical, but it does seem like it's taken quite a while to get to that trial point.
Yeah, and you nailed it too, especially when you're dealing with a death penalty case. The judges are just going to give that much more deference to the defense because they certainly don't want to do anything in the pre-trial stage that might create appealable issues down the road. And one of those that they could do is rush the defense to trial when the defense is screaming that they're not ready to go to trial. This is a complicated case in the sense that it's voluminous discovery. You've got, all sorts of genetic, DNA discovery that they're going to have to deal with. There was the, way in which they used that IgG investigation to track him down. There were search warrants conducted. There was a cross-country investigation. There's just a lot of moving parts, and a lot of information has been turned over to the defense. And so they have from the very beginning been saying, we need more time. We need more time. And the defense is usually the ones that control the clock to some extent. So I imagine that they've had enough time. I don't think it's likely that we will see any further delays, but they've also been very litigious throughout this. I mean, remember, we spent a lot of time just moving this trial from one part of Idaho to another. That put some delays into everything. And now these extensive evidentiary hearings and challenges to warrants and everything else, each one of those is just kind of taking time. But it seems to me like Judge Hippler has really put a line in the sand on this trial date, and he's trying to stick with it.
And he's, you know, Tar, do you know Hippler at all, Judge Hippler? Have you ever? I mean, he seems like he's quite serious and has a real command of the courtroom. What's his reputation there? And by the way, thank you, Tiny Grandma, for the happy birthday to the COE. But what is his reputation?
You know, he's a well-respected judge who's been on the bench for quite some time. I think, you know, in a lot of ways, he's no nonsense. You could see that from the way that he conducts these hearings. It's really impressive. I mean, they're required to do it and get up to speed on a case that's assigned to them, to a new judge. And I think he's done a really impressive job of getting up to speed really quickly on a case that has really voluminous records and filings and briefing. And you can see in these hearings how engaged he is. I mean, he's, you know, there's been a couple of occasions where he's corrected one side or the other. Well, you know, one of them was, I think, the garbage can trash pull. He's like, well, wait a minute, you said this, but isn't this true? And I think it was the state prosecutor who corrected himself, said, I misspoke, you know, so that's a pretty remarkable memory and attention to detail.
Debbie Gibby here. Josh Ritter, interesting point. I'm still pissed they tore that house down, which there was that debate back and forth, and they ended up tearing down the house. The DNA could belong to anyone who is in and out of that party house. Does it matter, Josh? Does it matter that it's torn down? I mean, there was a huge debate about it prior to being torn down. You know, they maybe wanted jurors, you know, the government to go visit. I don't think the defense would have wanted that, but how big a deal or not that the house was in fact razed, R-A-Z-E-D?
I hope it's not a big deal, but I think time is going to tell. I mean, to me, it was inexplicable and unforgivable. I mean, you've got one of the most closely watched, highly contested trials in that state. It seems, you know, okay, let's board up a house for a while, even if it takes a year or two, and just make sure that there are not any problems. But now, having destroyed it, who knows what might happen in trial? As I sit here right now, I can't foresee any problems, but who knows what might happen in trial? There might be issues in that a critical piece of evidence has been destroyed. And I do believe that home is a critical piece of evidence. I mean, the way that Kohberger allegedly was able to get into that home, which rooms he traveled to first, the dynamics of the home in that some of the roommates who were sleeping in that home were unable to hear the murders taking place in other rooms. All of that has to do with the dynamics and setup of that home. And no matter how many pictures you put together or how many diagrams you show to the jury, perhaps even bringing the jury out to that crime scene might have been something that would be important. And we won't know until trial starts. And I'll tell you this too, when you're dealing with a death penalty case that, like we talked about, as much as the judge is going to be kind of deferential and making sure that everything is done properly ahead of time, post this, if there is a conviction, they're going to appeal everything. And one of those issues very well might be they didn't have the home, the scene of the crime available to them at the time of trial. And that was important for whatever reason they want to insert. And that could have been avoided. So I agree with everybody's frustration that they tore it down. It just made no sense to me why it needed to be done so quickly.
Me either. But I know that, you know, it was obviously a hot button topic. This is interesting here from Ned Smith. The words Karen Reed are not allowed in STS chat, so I have vowed to not cover part 2. However, with the caveat, I always turn to STS Nation, best guest, better community. If you email me with an interesting creative idea at survivingthesurvivor@gmail.com, about a unique way to cover it. In other words, either calling out both sides, or covering it as the circus that it is, not to minimize John O'Keefe's death. It bothers me because he's lost in all of this. But if anyone has a unique, I was thinking about this last night and I couldn't come up with anything, but if anyone has an interesting take that's unusual about how to cover it, I will definitely consider doing that, but it can't be just like, this is what happened in court today. It's got to be something other than that, because otherwise I can't bear to do it. I did say yesterday I might go in as like the heel, like the super bad guy, pick one side and just go crazy, and stick to my guns and get everyone on the other side incredibly angry. That would probably be risking my life to some extent. But if anyone has, again, a good idea about how to do this, let me know. Of course, Ned Smith will be up in arms, yelling into the echo chamber right now about that. Wendy is watching from Boise, from there you go, Nampa, Idaho. And again, I think Josh and I are going to try to get out there to cover this for each of our channels, but maybe do some stuff together. So, Josh, just go back to this, because this is confusing to me, confusing to everyone else. Can you just explain, touch DNA, it's sort of obvious what it is, but what it is and the importance of it here, using IgG to trace it back to Bryan Kohberger. And even the judge brought it up, saying, look, no matter what about this blood DNA, you still have the touch DNA. So what is touch DNA? How important is it going to be in this case?
Well, it's exactly what it sounds like. It's DNA that was left not by some sort of bodily fluid, not to get too gross about it, but we can get DNA from saliva, we can get DNA from blood, we can get DNA from tears, we can get DNA from, in any way that the human body leaks a fluid, we can get DNA from that, but we can also get DNA from just the flaking off of skin cells when you touch a surface. And some people are more inclined to leave behind DNA than others. So the advancements in DNA technology are such that they're able to pick up just this minuscule amount of DNA that's left behind just from somebody even touching something. Now, I know that some people are trying to draw some sort of great distinction between the idea that you have blood DNA and that you have touch DNA, and which is stronger. In my view, and I'm no expert on this, but from the scientists and experts that I've ever dealt with on this, there is no difference. As long as they have enough genetic material to create a profile, they're going to create as strong a profile with either. The only difference really is, what does it tell you that someone was bleeding at a crime scene as opposed to not bleeding and just leaving behind a touch? And maybe there's some significance to that the individual that touched or came near the handrail may have been bleeding. Is there significance to that, in that you're dealing with a stabbing murder? And is there significance to the fact that the DNA on the knife sheath is not blood? I don't know. And that might be something to be argued at trial. But as far as like its significance, one of the things we had talked and touched on is that the DNA profile from the handrail and the glove outside were not submitted to CODIS. And I don't want to jump ahead, but the reason for that is that there are I'm blanking on the term I'm trying to find, but there are guidelines. There are some certain protocols in order to submit a DNA sample into the CODIS system, that you can't just take any genetic material that you find anywhere on a crime scene, but there has to be some very clear nexus between that evidence that you found and what you believe to be the perpetrator. Well, here, the person who touched that knife sheath is very likely connected to the crime we're talking about when we're talking about a stabbing. The person who was near a handrail or left a glove outside may or may not be. And so that was the reasons why it wasn't submitted. One more thing on this, and then I'll shut up, is that the defense also is trying to say that because the idea that these other DNA findings were not disclosed to the magistrate in order to secure a warrant against Kohberger that somehow was improper, and that the judge should have been made aware of that when signing the warrant. And because the judge was not, they're trying to challenge the warrant, which Hippler has still yet to even decide if he's even going to have a hearing on that. So that's all of the ways in which the defense is trying to take this evidence and make hay of it.
By the way, I have, as they say in TV news, a hard out at 1 o'clock today, but we have about another 35 minutes, so we're going to get through a bunch of things that we have not caught up with regarding this case. Look at this, Francois here, watching from Jersey Channel Island, and that would not be Newark, Josh Ritter. That would be the actual Jersey Channel Island, somewhere out there off the coast of the UK and France. And I would like to visit there. We need to do a podcast from there at some point in the near future. Shout out to Copper Horse. She just donated 20 memberships in the COE on her birthday, donating 10 memberships. Giving, the best gift that there is what I teach my kids. And then I go and buy myself useless things. So, Tara, real quick, the crime scene, just back to this for a moment. Someone did point out, and I forgot about this, it was 3D laser scan. So there's like a 3D, there will be like a 3D model of this available, I assume, to the jurors, whoever needs to take a look at it. Do you think that's enough? You heard Josh kind of air his grievances about the fact that it should not have been torn down. And I get without being a lawyer, I sort of, my gut instinct tells me what was the big deal with leaving it up for another few months. I get the sensitivity and people don't want to see it and it's all those things, but will a 3D rendering, a 3D laser model be enough? Or do you think also that they should have left it up?
I think they should have left it up. I mean, I think, when this first came up and news broke that the house was going to be taken down, I think there were a number of us on your show and in other places that were talking about, like, why would you do that? Leave it up for a number of different reasons. Number one, if defense claims there was some sort of piece of evidence that was forgotten or that wasn't looked into, or an area that wasn't searched as thoroughly as it should have been searched. I think another reason is, there have been a number of trials, murder trials, capital offense kind of trials over the years where the jurors have gone to the crime scene and they've walked through it. And the information that you get from going there and being there, I don't personally believe can be replicated by just a video that has been taken or photographs that has been taken by some other folks. I mean, I think that there is just a difference for all the reasons that Josh was talking about. I mean, we're talking about a case where there may be evidence that some of the remaining roommates didn't hear the commotion of what was going on. A juror might sit there and go, well, how is that even possible? Is that even credible testimony? And walking through a home and being able to say, oh, okay, well, there's quite a bit of distance between these two rooms, or there's a big staircase and, really thick wall between, gives you a different perspective than watching a video where someone is walking throughout the halls and they're doing some sort of 3D modeling of it. You're not seeing the thickness of the walls. You're not talking about or observing firsthand some of those details that I think are really, really important, especially when you're talking about the credibility of witnesses.
Those are all really good points. And it reminds me of the Alec Murdaugh case, most recently, high profile, where they went and visited Moselle, if you remember that name. They went and walked around, and I think it gave jurors a really good sense of how things could have unfolded there. There are some kind of big questions here, Josh, and one of them obviously is outside of this touch DNA, which is, I think, a pretty big deal, but there's really no physical link between Bryan Kohberger and the four young victims. No victim DNA or blood was found in his apartment. They executed a search warrant, none in his car, none in his personal belongings. They searched his car multiple times, even dismantling components. No forensic evidence at all. And we're talking about a brutal crime that happened in a matter of 15 minutes. And there was really nothing left behind except for this touch DNA. that in and of itself is just really odd and bizarre. People think he wore like that jumpsuit, like almost like a Tyvek jumpsuit, but how much does that play into the hand of the defense? Because I mean, it's a difficult crime. I don't want to get like macabre about it, but it's a difficult crime to commit in that amount of time with that amount of DNA and blood evidence that didn't appear to be there. So what is the deal with all that?
No, you're absolutely right. I think that is a very strong argument for the defense, and I think we're going to hear a lot about that. This was a very bloody crime scene, and stabbing deaths in particular, because of the personal nature of it, because you have to be in physical contact with that person, because it involves a lot of physical activity with stabbing somebody, multiple times. There is just, it's almost unthinkable to people that wouldn't result in a lot of genetic material being left on the perpetrator of that crime, and therefore transferred to their vehicle that they used to get away from the crime, therefore transferred to their apartment. The defense has also, or others have pointed out that home had a dog. How about dog hairs being all over the place? How about carpet fibers? How about whatever else was in that home? You would think that somehow they would be able to find how that had attached itself to the suspect and then made its way back to his vehicle or home. And they found absolutely nothing. Now, the defense is going to make all of those arguments because, as much as it just seems remarkable to us, they're hoping that the jury feels the same way. I learned a very long time ago, as a young lawyer from a very experienced pathologist, who would always say, the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. And what she meant by that is, just because you cannot find this evidence does not mean the person was not there. You cannot point to not finding evidence and saying that is proof of somehow somebody wasn't involved. So is it remarkable? Absolutely. But it could also mean that he cleaned up really well. It could mean that they simply missed it. There could have been genetic material from the victims inside of his car or inside the home, and they just were not able to find it. Listen, the defense is going to make it sound like that's impossible, but the prosecution's going to have to explain to jurors that just because they didn't find it doesn't mean that you can now exclude him as a suspect. But sure, I mean, this whole case is going to come down to DNA, in my view, because if they don't have that DNA linking Bryan Kohberger, the defense has explanations or at least arguments for everything else that the prosecution has. But unless they find some sort of innocent explanation for why his DNA ended up on that knife sheath, or through all of these pre-trial hearings get the DNA remarkably kicked out, that is the centerpiece of the prosecution's entire case.
That's a great point. I mean, Tara, it raises a really big question. I've got a lot of questions on the heels of that, but I mean, number one, someone committed this crime, and if it wasn't Bryan, it was somebody else. I'm not saying that it wasn't him, but whoever did it cleaned up really well, because someone committed that crime and there wasn't a lot of evidence. So that kind of goes to Josh's point of, the lack of evidence doesn't mean that there is no evidence or that someone wasn't there. But this touch DNA for the defense, they're going to have to come up with a reason for it being there, correct? Walk us through kind of inside baseball. What do you think is going on with Ann Taylor and the attorneys representing Bryan Kohberger? What kind of thing could they throw out there? Like, how could his touch DNA get on a knife sheath, which is the weapon used to kill these people, inside of that home? Like, it just, again, I think everything, like Josh said, hinges on that, because if they can't explain why, it's pretty much game over, right?
Yeah, I think that's that really is the most critical piece of evidence here, and it's the strongest piece of evidence that we know of right now, without knowing all the evidence or seeing the trial where evidence is presented. And that's a huge hurdle for the defense. Now, when you are in trial, you are having to get your evidence in through witnesses. And when you do that, especially with scientific evidence, you need to be able to lay the foundation for that evidence. You got to, I call it building the house. You got to build the house before you get the conclusion that says this evidence, this DNA was Bryan Kohberger's DNA. And so, it's not easy peasy for the state either. So if something in the process was messed up, if there was, let's say some sort of contamination of the DNA, if a process wasn't followed, there is a possibility that they couldn't have it introduced into evidence and it wouldn't go before the jury. I find that hard to believe, but, possible. I think the other thing that, the defense perhaps could do is poke holes and say, maybe it was planted there. Maybe somebody else put his, DNA there. Maybe somebody framed him, especially if you've got DNA from 2 or 3 unidentified males in the area, setting aside for a moment when were they there? When did the DNA, when did that come to be, I guess is the best way to put it. But they are going to look for opportunities to create and to poke holes and to highlight doubt. And I think, it's hard. It's really difficult. I think it's going to be a bit of an uphill battle here for the defense. But, perhaps they have some ace up their sleeve and we don't know about it yet. And that hasn't been disclosed yet. And they're going to be chipping away at different aspects of this, right? So, we've talked about the cell phone in the past and the cell phone pings in the past. They might talk about the range of the cell phone. So each kind of building block that the state is putting together, the defense is going to, like Josh was saying, is going to have an explanation. They're going to be able to explain, or they're going to try to explain this away. And so when we get finally to the DNA, the jury may have questions already, and they may just kind of push on an alternative theory that the state is going to have to rebut.
And someone pointed out, by the way, that Bryan Kohberger, who I believe was caught about 7 weeks after the fact, he had all that time to get rid of evidence, continue to clean up, while police were hunting him down. Josh mentioned a dog. And this is a potential new defense angle that was sort of, discussed in court briefly, that Kaylee's dog is found unharmed in the room. The dog had no blood on it, didn't track blood throughout the house, and it suggests, according to the defense, some crime scene inconsistencies in the crime scene analysis. Do you agree with that, Josh, or was this dog just locked in a room and didn't get blood on it? How important or not important is this dog? And that brings us back to like the O.J. Simpson days with the Akita. But what about this dog?
I think it comes down to the defense is going to try to highlight as much that may seem remarkable to us at first glimpse, and therefore turn that into, because it's remarkable, it's inexplicable, and therefore should cause you to doubt what the prosecution is telling you, or what the investigators have done, or what their theory is behind the case. But, I've been doing this long enough to know that sometimes there's just bizarreness in cases. Sometimes there's just mysteries. Is it bizarre and kind of spectacular to me that the dog didn't track through any blood in that home and that the dog remained unharmed? Absolutely it is. But does that mean that somehow Bryan Kohberger isn't good for it, or the murders were committed by somebody else? No, it doesn't. And I remember I would spend a lot of time when I was a prosecutor trying to explain this concept to jurors during voir dire. And I would say, listen, I'm going to answer every question regarding the elements in this case beyond a reasonable doubt. That's what I intend to do. But you are all 12 smart, curious, inquisitive folks, and I cannot answer every question that may arise in your mind as this trial goes on. And the same is going to take place here. We're going to hear stuff throughout the course of this trial that is just going to be remarkable, and we're going to say, I don't get that. How is that possible? But the prosecution's job is going to be able to say, okay, don't allow that to distract you. Keep your eyes on the prize here. I mean, again, to get back to the fact that they didn't find any victim DNA or evidence from that home in Bryan Kohberger's car and house, to me is just, I'm blown away. I'm blown away that they were able to find his, this touch DNA on the sheath, but they couldn't find anything in his vehicle and his home. That to me just is astounding. But again, it doesn't necessarily mean he's not good for it. It just means it's one of those little mysteries that the prosecution is going to have to deal with.
Yeah. And I mean, Tar, I assume that part of what the government is going to do, they're going to say, well, this guy was a PhD in criminology. This is what he studied. He knew how to get rid of evidence better than most because, this was going to be his career choice. Is that a possibility that they're going to go down that route?
Yeah, I think that they'll introduce evidence that he had greater knowledge than the average person to try and explain, why no other DNA was found. I mean, again, we don't know all the evidence yet. We're not privy to all of that until the trial. But
and by the
from
way,
what
let
we
me
know
just
so far-
I'm sorry, let me
Yeah.
hop in there because someone mentioned, we're under they're under a gag order. So does that make it even more I guess obvious or believable that there's going to be evidence that we have not been introduced to yet?
Oh, I mean, I think in every case, right? I mean, even if we take the Lori Vallow Daybell case, we didn't know all the evidence that the state had until we watched the trial, all of us together, and they were introducing things that we'd never heard of before. So we're getting bits and pieces of information, through some of these search warrant applications, through some of the briefing of the parties. But again, there's a lot that's sealed. There's a gag order in place. And so people aren't giving some sort of extensive commentary about what other evidence is out there. But yeah, I mean, I think the prosecution is going to have to explain some of these things. Not everything. They're going to have to meet the elements and their burden of proof, but they're also going to have to take the wind out of the sail, so to speak, or have some sort of narrative and explanation for some of the more obvious, things about, why wasn't there DNA anywhere else? And I think the background and education of Bryan Kohberger, I think that's fair game to be introduced by the state to try and explain something like that away.
Yeah, I would agree. Mary Kolovich here to Josh. What about the writings of Bryan Kohberger? Some of those have been released about how someone would kill. Will that be allowed into trial? That seems awfully prejudicial, but what is the line there, Josh? Is it significant? I mean, in a murder case, it seems to me like it's significant, but how does a judge rule on that?
That's a great question because the judge is going to have to make exactly that call that you just outlined, weighing the prejudicial versus probative value of it. Now, I will say that usually almost anything that a defendant has said, it comes in as a prior statement of the defendant, and the prosecution almost has unlimited ability to present those types of statements. This is a little bit different in that it's writings. There could be arguments that these are just kind of personal musings, and therefore to put somebody's personal journal in front of a jury might overly prejudice them, depending on how the jury would receive that evidence. I think, foundationally, they're going to have to establish how soon in time. If this is a journal he kept 5 years ago, there's going to be more problems than if it was something, writings that he made soon before the murders. But I tell you what, the prosecution's going to try to. I mean, I've seen this many times before where, from personal journals to rap lyrics, prosecutors are going to try to get those in if they feel that somehow it exposes the inner workings of a defendant's mind, and that's important to the jury.
Josh, you reminded me too that investigators, when we were talking ahead of the show, did not reveal the unidentified, that's the blood DNA, to the magistrate when getting a warrant for Kohberger. Is that problematic? Just the fact that, they didn't dot their I's and cross their T's there.
So what they were trying to argue to the judge is that there is a way to challenge a warrant if you feel that somehow the investigators gave a skewed version of the facts to a magistrate in order to secure a warrant. They left out things that were important, or they somehow manipulated the facts in such a way, because for everybody to understand, there's no the defense is not involved in this process. Obviously, it's just investigators dealing directly with the judge. So there's a lot of concern about how fair are investigators going to be when they really want to secure a warrant against somebody that they believe to have killed 4 college students. This was brought up in front of Hippler, and Hippler kind of made the comment without making the ruling of, yeah, okay, even if that's true, there's unidentified DNA. That doesn't do anything about the fact that your client's DNA was found on a knife sheath in a case that allegedly involved a knife, and that knife allegedly goes to that sheath. I really like, I'm butchering his quote, but I really like the way that he laid it out. Was just kind of like, we're dealing with the probable cause for Bryan Kohberger. The fact that there was other evidence there of other people having been in that home at some time in the past doesn't affect his probable cause. So I think end of the day, it's not going to be an issue. But I think what he still has not decided on is if he's even going to have what we call a Frank's hearing to see, to even flesh this out. Were they honest? Did they give all the information they should have to the judge? I don't even know if he's ordered that to happen yet.
And the Franks is about like suppressing discovery. Is that right, Josh?
It's about challenging the warrant for the reasons I just explained, that they were not honest, they were somehow deceptive, or not fair enough in the presentation of evidence to a judge. And therefore, if you can say that that's wrong, if there was a problem with the affidavit, then you can challenge the warrant. And now we're talking huge problems, because those warrants are what eventually led to, the arrest of Bryan Kohberger. I don't know, Tara, do you know, has he said it? He kind of left it open.
He hasn't.
Okay.
Yeah, he hasn't ruled on that yet. No, you're exactly right. He hasn't ruled on that yet. And it's really hard to get, Josh knows, it's really hard to get a Franks hearing. You're basically saying that law enforcement lied in the process of getting a warrant, and that they didn't disclose what's called exculpatory information or evidence, meaning information or evidence that points away from the suspect and casts doubt onto whether or not the suspect is actually involved in this, or and it's a big deal, because like Josh said, it's one-sided, right? In a lot of ways. When you get a warrant, you go with the officer, they write an affidavit, they swear in front of the judge, the magistrate judge, here's all the info I have, this is probable cause, please give me this warrant to go and get, additional information to explore whether or not, we're filing a case. We have enough evidence to file a case against this person. So it's a huge hurdle to get a Franks hearing, and it's a pretty serious accusation to make. You're saying that in that process, someone misinformed and lied. Very intentionally lied to the judge in order to get a warrant. And so it tosses potentially all the warrants out and all the evidence obtained from those warrants. And so you don't, unlike other motions, like other suppression motions, where you can just file a motion with the court and it's heard, like they did with, the cell phone data and the apartment search and all this other stuff, Google and Amazon. You don't automatically get a Franks hearing just because you file a motion for a Franks hearing. And it's because it's already gone through the process of going through a judge, right? A magistrate judge has already looked at it. And so you really have to make a preliminary showing to the court that you are entitled or deserve one, because, here's the information that shows that there was some sort of lie that occurred. Then you have a whole evidentiary hearing about that. So it's a longer process.
And to add one more
Josh.
point on this too, is that it's important to understand the purpose of the affidavit that is given to the judge from law enforcement. That is not to summarize every aspect of the case from beginning to end, nuts to bolts. Here's everything we've ever learned. It is simply to give the judge kind of a rough frame understanding of why they need to be able to, violate the Fourth Amendment, not violate it, but why they need to get around the protections of the Fourth Amendment and conduct a search on somebody's property or person. And so they need to give the judge probable cause to sign off on that. But that does, just because they leave out certain things, and many times these affidavits leave out a lot because they're really just concerned with, why do we have probable cause to be able to search this person's person or property? So the exclusion of this information does not ring a bunch of alarm bells.
I just want you both to know, while we're in heavy, deep discussion about a serious trial, the chat is talking about tomatoes versus rhubarb. I don't even know what a rhubarb is, and I have no idea why. I mean, I've heard of rhubarb. I don't want to know what a rhubarb is, and it's fascinating to me. Another reason to do a cooking show. Josh Ritter, two things for you. I mean, you said earlier the defense doesn't even really want this mysterious blood DNA tested, because if it comes back to Joe Schmo, who's on the soccer team, who's, living in Seattle and clearly has nothing to do with this, they don't want that out there. They want to leave it nebulous and mysterious. Ooh, this is someone else's blood DNA. Am I correct about that?
I think absolutely. Strategically, I think that the defense is much happier with the idea that they know it's male. I think that's important, because at least the roommate who's an eyewitness to someone in the home describes that person as a male. Nothing beyond that, but we know that a male suspect was likely involved in this, and that it's unknown. I think that plays much more into the arguments they can make in front of a jury that, hey, there are other suspects out there. And hey, by the way, they never even submitted this to CODIS, and try to make, some sort of argument that the prosecution was very myopic in their investigation and didn't want to look at other leads. And they only focused on Bryan Kohberger, and it ignored anything that might have pointed them any other direction. Because you're absolutely right. Last thing they want to do is have this tested, and it comes back to, somebody's uncle who was living across the country at the time that the murders take place. And then now it's not even coming in during trial. It's not even important. It's completely irrelevant evidence. At least now it maintains some relevance in the fact that it is at the scene, it is male, and it is untested or unidentified.
This is an interesting question, Tara. This is a law school question. What is the correct way of using federal grand jury evidence from a subpoena as opposed to a warrant by the state in an affidavit for probable cause for a state warrant? I'm already lost.
Interesting question. So I don't know how to exactly answer that. So, and it has to go with the purpose of a grand jury. So a grand jury is called and can hear evidence, and that's also one-sided. It's by the prosecution only, and as part of that, the grand jury has subpoena power, so they can subpoena additional information and send that out and get that before them, and they can consider it in making their decision. A state affidavit for probable cause, and I hope I'm answering your question. I think I might be. State affidavit for probable cause. So if local law enforcement, if state law enforcement is or even federal agents are out helping in a case that's going to be taken by the state potentially, they use search warrants and request that information in order to get to probable cause for their matter. So it's not evidence, it's information, and it's an investigative tool. So both your subpoena that goes out as well as your search warrant that goes out, those are investigative tools through the court process that are used to gather information and in order to determine whether a crime was committed by a particular person.
This is Tara Malik. Songbit says she's good at explaining things. I don't remember her name, but it is Tara Malik.
You don't have to. It's okay.
Yeah. Josh, and you get an A on your law school test. Josh Ritter. So I think everyone knows I'm a little weird, but that's okay. So, I'm very curious, and you're a prosecutor of the year. What is Ann Taylor doing today on a random Wednesday in February with this trial in April? Is all her time being spent on this? And how do you divide up this workload? I mean, there's so many things, so many avenues to go down. I mean, what does she do on any given day, and how does she know what to do on any given day?
The first question is, I think, absolutely, this is all that they're spending their time on, and several attorneys at that.
This
and
is why I love Ned Smith. Look at this. Ann Taylor's watching the Karen Reed trial. Now, if we can get Ann Taylor to host Karen Reed commentary on the second channel, then we'll do it. Go ahead.
Then you'll make an exception. But yeah, I mean, I've worked on some very large, high profile cases, I would say similar in magnitude to this. And it takes an entire team working nonstop because, it's one of those things where you only get one shot at this. You want to know the evidence better than your opposition forward and backwards. And then it's just kind of the preparation of exhibits and the order of witnesses that will be called, who's going to cross-examine who, each person that needs to prepare for the cross-examination of a witness, that's going to take, sometimes days of preparation to get ready for that different person. It is amazing the amount of work that really goes into putting on one of these huge, complicated, high importance type trials. So yeah, I think they're working around the clock on this.
Yeah. So I was reading, which I do occasionally, a pretty well-known criminal profiler, a guy named John Kelly, was quoted in a story. And I thought that was interesting because if you remember, when Bryan Kohberger was taken into custody, his literal first question was, "Who else did you arrest?" So, Tara, this criminal profile thinks that this other blood DNA, I mean, this is a little far-fetched, but it's interesting, could have been staged or put there by Bryan Kohberger to confuse the enemy, to confuse, potential prosecution in this case. Again, he'd have to really have thought this out. But this profiler, John Kelly, who is, he's no quack. I think people take him pretty seriously. He said that this guy, could have possibly thought it out through this much because of his background in criminology. But that's certainly something that, I mean, the government could use to muddy the defense waters there with this blood DNA. But is that a road that they would even ever go down?
I mean, my first thought is good luck getting that in. I mean, that's really, I mean, that's an interesting theory. I'm not a profiler. I don't even play one on TV. So I would have to defer to his expertise and why, I don't know why he believes that. I think, when you're admitting evidence or trying to admit evidence at trial, it has to be, it has to be relevant, and it has to go to a claim or defense, that's being raised in the trial. And some things like that, I would anticipate would be, if the state, for instance, wanted to go down that road, that might be something that they would want a preliminary ruling or a pretrial ruling from the court in what's called like a motion in limine, or the defense would, and ask the court to exclude it prior to the trial, because once you start down that road in a trial and partially introduce something like that into the mix, first of all, it can't be speculative. And second of all, if it goes in there and they can't get the conclusion out because they can't lay the foundation for it, you've rung this bell in front of the jury, and you could have a mistrial. I mean, you could really mess up the case entirely. So, that's the first time I've heard that one. I don't know. Maybe Josh, you've heard of it, but I've not heard that one before.
Yeah, it's a little creative, I would say. So those who have not been following this closely, there was a change of venue from Moscow, Latah County, Idaho, to where Tara is in Boise, Idaho. So that's where the trial is going to take place. Judge Stephen Hippler has ruled that the death penalty remains a possible sentence for Kohberger if convicted. When would that ultimate ruling come, Josh Ritter? Does that come before the beginning of the regular trial, and how soon before?
It comes before, and I'm surprised it hasn't been made already. I really, you would think this would be something that they would have. I'm a little shocked by that's still kind of open-ended, whether or not I know they heavily litigated it, whether or not it should be taken off the table. I would expect that if he hasn't made a ruling on it already and I just missed it, I would expect that they would want to have that clarified well before they ever even begin. Well, certainly before they begin jury selection, because that's going to be a huge part of jury selection. Is they're going to have to, have what's called a death qualified jury that, are people who are able to say that they can even vote for the death penalty if they feel that it was appropriate, and people who are just morally, religiously will never allow for that would be people who are dismissed. So they need to have an answer to that well before they even begin jury selection.
Yeah, and this is a really interesting question. If Dr. Ramsland testifies, for those who do not know, she is a criminology professor at DeSales, which is where Bryan Kohberger was doing his master's degree. She's written a book with Dennis Rader, the BTK serial killer. Are we going to see her called to the stand, Tara? This is interesting. Since she did teach him, is she going to be subpoenaed? Are you going to get a expert on killers testifying at a trial, revolving around, a person who many believe is now a notorious killer himself?
Unsure. I don't know for what purpose they would call her, and who would be calling her. I mean, the couple possibilities. If she knew him, maybe if this gets to or past the guilt phase and it gets into part 2, which is the death penalty phase, she comes in and testifies one side or the other as to, his character in the death penalty phase. Seems, I'm not super familiar with, what all she may or may not know, but an expert is someone who has specialized knowledge and skill about a topic that most people don't. That's the definition of an expert. And so expert testimony holds a lot of weight. And again, any testimony that's going to be introduced at trial is going to have to be relevant to the issues before the jury. And so it's not often that a judge is just going to, willy-nilly let an expert come in and opine on something that doesn't go to what the prosecution has to prove or what the defense is trying to raise if they put on a case. So if she's generally talking about serial killers, maybe if the state is trying to show that as part of the curriculum that Bryan Kohberger was learning, he would learn about, I don't know, I'm throwing something out there, but like cleaning up a crime scene or, all those things that we talked about, knowledge of, and perhaps the prosecution tries to introduce that evidence in that way. Not sure.
Yeah. So there you have it. Tara Malik is a defense attorney out of Boise, Idaho. Is this going to be a death penalty case? Tara, your final thoughts real quick.
I think so.
There you go. I do too. Josh Ritter, former prosecutor of the year in LA, current criminal defense attorney, and most importantly, host of Courtroom Confidential. And Afton Fared wants to know, Josh, are we doing a live tonight?
We are.
Yeah. What
5
time?
p.m. Pacific, 8 p.m. Eastern. Please tune in. Hope that doesn't conflict with the STS folks, but that's when we'll be there.
We're going to be at birthday dinner, but I will make sure kids, I will force them to stream Courtroom Confidential instead of either playing Roblox or all my kids do. My 5-year-old goes, "Hey, do you know Royalty Family?" I go, "Who? What?" Royalty Family. Pulls it up. 73 million subscribers. Their last video had, 49 million views. He loves rubbing it in. 5 years old. Can't take it. Rubs it in.
Ouch.
And he goes
Trolling.
He's learning how to count. And he's like, is 75 million more than 7? And I'm like, yeah, it's a little bit more. All right. Love you. I got to run. See you guys tomorrow. Huge thanks to Tara. Huge thanks to Josh. And we'll have him back on to discuss Bryan Kohberger. If I cover Karen Reed, it better be a good way to cover it. Let me know. I'm leaning against it. Thank you, everybody. Love you. See you tomorrow. We're doing Luigi Mangione. We'll be back. And that is it.